I'm looking at my paper at the enablers of corporate tax evasion specifically. And I began my research with quite a broad question, which is why do we have such a dysfunctional global tax governance system that allows multinational corporations to get away without paying so much tax? And why is there this disjunct between where multinational corporations do business and where do they pay tax? And why have the reform programs so far failed to adequately address this problem, even to the point where it seems to be getting worse? There's been international outrage with the cases exposed by things like the Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers, for example, like this example of Nike and how it's shifting profits from all its sales from Europe and the Middle East and Africa into Netherlands and then through to Bermuda, which is a zero corporate tax jurisdiction. Can you still hear me if it's here? Okay. So the institutional inertia that I'm looking at is the rules that were set up by the League of Nations in the 1920s have basically been left unchanged. So we've got at the core of global governance something that was established 100 years ago and hasn't been adapted to the realities of globalized trade. So I'm looking here at things like the bilateral double taxation treaties, the principle of separate entity accounting, and arm's length pricing rules to try to bridge the gap and make sure that we then reach unitary taxation. This system has been justified because it's supposed to mitigate double taxation, and it's supposed to avoid the infringement of sovereignty and how states deal with their share of the transnational tax base. But however, we're obviously all well aware of the results of these rules in terms of enabling multinationals to avoid tax through profit shifting, eroding the tax base of countries around the world, and fostering tax competition between states. So what we see with global tax governance is something like a regulatory game of cat and mouse. Instead of fundamentally reforming the core rules, organizations like the OECD and the EU have engaged in rule layering. So it's trying to close loopholes by creating ever more complex layers of rules, which in turn create more loopholes. So this just enables the tax planning industry to engage in what we call creative compliance. And the OECD has basically admitted that with regards to regulating transfer pricing through arm's length pricing rules, identifying those comparable market prices is in most cases difficult or impossible. So they admit that this doesn't work. So what we see is increasing elaboration and complexity of tax rules that hasn't closed the gap between where multinationals do business and where they pay tax. So my paper tries to explain why these reform programs, which these organizations have been embarking on for several decades, have been so ineffective and why corporate tax evasion is still such a big problem. So first I'll outline my theoretical understanding of the institutional framework of global tax governance, and then I'll present my analysis of how multinational corporations and the tax planning industry have been able to channel and delay reforms to the global tax system and the types of power at their disposal. And finally, I'll examine what this means for the reform movement being led by civil society actors like the Tax Justice Network. So I see global tax governance as an arena of contestation involving a constellation of actors in which ideas, knowledge, and discourses play a crucial role in countervailing processes of resistance and reform. I found in my research that the theories of like rational choice and path dependency that are typical for historical institutionalism were not really that satisfying. They don't really provide a full picture of internal processes of endogenous change that can shape the institutional change over time. And I think it's also important not to see states as like unitary rational actors with a straightforward set of interests. Obviously, states have gained different advantages from the way in which they engage with global tax governance, but it serves narrow interests of different people, and I don't think we can just take states as unitary actors. So the way I came to think about it was that there's stability and continuity at the heart of global tax governance is not something that's automatic and self-perpetuating and self-reinforcing, but rather it's like the result of the mobilization of multinational corporations and the tax planning industry to shape how states understand their interests, values, and identities. So this is where they have their power to channel and delay reform. And to explain these dynamics, I've borrowed Carstensen and Smith's taxonomy of 3 different types of ideational power. So the ideational power, I feel like, is one element. Material power is another one. We've spoken over the last 2 days quite a lot about the imbalance of material power between, say, tax collection agencies as opposed to accountancy firms, which have vast resources, as well as legal firms. But I think the power of ideas is something which we really need to take quite seriously. So there's 3 types of power: power over ideas, power in and through ideas, and power over ideas. So I'll just quickly explain what these terms mean. So power in ideas takes place through the establishing of hegemony or institutions imposing constraints on what ideas are considered. This refers to the background processes that affect which ideas are considered viable and reasonable, while others are too extreme or unrealistic. And these background processes form deeper level ideational and institutional structures that produce and constitute actors' self-understandings, identity, and perceived interests. And this can include ideas that are taken for granted, that are depoliticized, unexamined, and even forgotten about. Power through ideas is understood as the capacity of actors to persuade other actors to accept and adopt their views through the use of ideational elements. Persuasion can be both a top-down and a bottom-up process, as actors draw on cognitive and normative frameworks to give meaning to their material and social circumstances and affect what ideas and discourses are deemed viable. And finally, power over ideas is the imposition of ideas and the power to resist the inclusion of alternative ideas into the policy-making arena. This power may come about as a result of the formation of epistemic communities, such as a group of technocratic experts with a shared outlook, able to harness enough legitimacy around their policy ideas to avoid considering alternative approaches or disregard them as untenable or not even qualified for discussion. So how do we see these types of ideational power playing out in global tax governance? I would argue that firstly, multinational corporations and the tax planning industry have really cleverly manipulated states' understanding of themselves as liberal, market-friendly, sovereign states, and this is the power in and through ideas. And secondly, the tax planning industry's embeddedness in a technocratic epistemic community of tax experts and their privileged and unchallenged status as a source of independent expertise has enabled them to use various channels of influence within policymaking and regulatory spheres. And I argue that this power over ideas has enabled them to promote the interests of corporate capital and dismiss or ignore reform ideas that would challenge the core principles of the institutional framework. So liberal economic theory provides the norms, cognitive frames, and meaning systems within which states come to act and understand the world. And multinational corporations in the tax planning industry have used this knowledge and consistently drawn on this liberal economic theory as a normative and cognitive ideational framework to lobby for their own interests. For example, they often choose to frame taxation as a cost rather than a transfer within the economy, and present information which seems to suggest that higher tax rates equals lower GDP growth. They also frame tax competition as a healthy dynamic which restrains excessive taxation, and propose that tax competition will exert market discipline over states that are being too greedy and trying to tax too much. So they bring this sort of like negative framing of tax as a cost rather than a benefit to society overall. And disregard the economic necessity of taxation as like an essential part of the compact between states and the corporation. You can see this in action when the OECD launched the harmful tax competition program in the 1990s. The whole program eventually reversed course after the massive mobilization of groups like the Heritage Foundation, and it came out in support of tax competition as a healthy dynamic, so it completely changed what it was originally set out to do. groups like the Institute for Economic Affairs and here in the UK even have the goal to frame tax havens as playing a vital role in ensuring the free flow of international capital. And also when tax havens have been targeted, these small states, rather than looking at tax havens in a more systemic way, but the small states that have been targeted have been forced to sign tax information exchange agreements, which is also, you can kind of interpret as in line with liberal economic theory because it blames market malfunctions on information asymmetries. So this, going this far to institute more information sharing basically means that government regulation might not be needed because all you need is to improve the availability and dissemination of information. On the side of sovereignty and the power in ideas of sovereignty, what we see with the representation of sovereignty as a notion is that there's this kind of paradoxical and one-sided way that the tax planning industry describes it. So they focus on how the current tax governance model defends the de jure sovereignty of nations, which is the legal right to design their own tax systems. But they ignore the fact that this completely undermines the kind of de facto sovereignty of a state in being able to attain their substantive policy goals of efficiency and equity through taxation. So in this regard, we can see sovereignty more being like a cognitive script, and also there's a mobilization of nationalism and this concept to sort of win states over. And you can see this like very much in action, especially from the US. They've taken very aggressive action over the years to sort of shift tax governance out of forums that are more democratic, like the UN, and bring it into forums like the OECD, where perhaps they have more power. And I think that this sort of like notion of sovereignty is something that's worth paying attention to. And yeah, finally, I think the power over ideas, the notion of having an epistemic community, we've discussed at great length. Sol also talked about it last night, so I won't go into it in too much detail now, but I think that this dynamic of technical complexity in global taxation governments has given rise to a situation of regulatory capture where policy making and rule interpretation is deeply influenced by the tax planning industry. So I think the net result of these phenomena is basically the institutionalization of the core principles of global tax governance by the virtue of their consistent and protracted use by an epistemic community of bureaucrats, regulators, lawyers, and they've come to form the taken for granted, unquestioned, legitimate basis for policy making and legal decision making. Under those conditions, people, and I think some people in this room have experienced this themselves, those who question the foundations of global taxation governance run the risk of being considered too radical and unrealistic and even finding themselves socially and professionally isolated. As for where this leaves the Tax Justice Network and other civil society groups, they've had to spend a lot of time and resources doing definitional work to recast the meanings of these cultural categories that have been so deeply entrenched in policymaking circles and the general public at large. And I would say that, maybe to summarize very quickly, it's important that we keep talking about justice. It's obviously where the Tax Justice Network and other groups can steal the march on the tax planning industry. But I think it's also too important to keep reframing these notions of sovereignty and liberal economic theory in our own terms. And I think the Tax Justice Network have done a great job of, for example, rejecting the notion of tax competition and framing it as tax wars because of the damage that these dynamics do. And maybe we need to tell a different story about the proper relationship between the corporation and the state and recognize that the two together, they're like formed over their history in partnership with one another. Liberal corporate capitalism has emerged as a mode of liberal government, helping the state to provide for the health, welfare, and security of the population, and one cannot survive without the other. Yeah, that's it. If you're interested in where I got the images from for this presentation, just a shameless plug of my own work, I've turned the findings from my dissertation into a comic, which I published on the Nib with the help of a really talented artist called Erlend from Norway. I'm now working with the Tax Justice Network to turn this into an animated video, so I'll keep you all posted when that's published.